Welcome to Stop Hiding, Start Healing, the podcast where we dive deep into the transformative journey of self-discovery and healing from addiction and other life struggles with your host, Craig Brown, author, speaker, and recovery pastor. Craig and his guests will guide you through conversations that empower, inspire, and illuminate the path towards a more authentic and fulfilling life. Together, we'll explore stories of triumph over adversity, expert insights on personal growth, and practical strategies to help you break free from the pain of the past through Christ-centered recovery. It's time to let go of fear, embrace vulnerability, and embark on a remarkable voyage of healing. Join us as we uncover the wisdom that emerges when we choose to stop hiding and start healing. Now, here is your host, Craig Brown.
Welcome to Stop Hiding, Start Healing. So glad you could join us for another episode where we discuss, well, just that, how to stop hiding your addiction, how to stop hiding your life struggle, how to stop hiding, whatever it is that you're going through, and get to that point where the pain is greater than your fear and you step out and find healing. As you know, of those of you that have listened, this is a platform for you. Hopefully anything that is shared here from my guests or myself will be used to move in your heart some way, shape, or form to help you, whatever. And maybe you're not even on a journey yet, but hopefully after listening to this episode especially, that you may realize that, now is the time. And it's different for all of us. It sure is different for every single one of us. But we're glad you join us. My guest today, he's coming to us all the way from Alaska. And that beautiful place of Alaska. Logan Hufford is born and raised in Alaska, married to his gorgeous wife, bride, Carrie, who herself is a fourth generation Alaskan. And together they're raising four amazing but crazy little kids. Says monkeys, and I asked him, I said, are you really are raising? No, they're kids, beautiful kids. Their life is a simple one. They love their family, their time, their dogs, and exploring the beautiful Alaskan wilderness. And yet, absolutely none of this should be possible today. And this is what Logan is really going to drill down on, what we're going to be talking about in depth. Because for years, Logan did just about everything in his power to destroy his marriage and his life. Logan was a raging sex addict. Porn, affairs, hiring prostitutes, and more had simply become a way of life for Logan. And he thought he had no hope. And that's maybe where you are today. Maybe you just feel completely hopeless because Logan had no hope until 2016. God began to change all that. So welcome my guest, Logan. So good to have you all the way from Alaska. Appreciate you taking the time. Absolutely. As you could probably tell by the bio, Logan has had quite a journey in his life in dealing with sex addiction and pornography. It is an issue that is rampant. It's permeated every realm of society, churches as well. There's a recent statistic, Logan, I was reading that 2 out of 3 Christian men and 1 out of 3 Christian women struggle with pornography. And another stat they shared, this is the Barna Group, another stat they shared, 58% of pastors struggle. It's just, you think about it. In the old days, you had to go to, the local store and look at the Playboy or do something like that, you had to go find it. Well, it comes and finds us on a regular basis. And so before we get too far down the road, can you please give us an idea? All of us the one thing all of us, those that are watching, listening, you and I, the one common denominator we all have is history. The one thing we have in common right off the bat. And what I like to ask, Logan, is take us back to what your youth was like, and growing up and family life and that type of set the premise for us there, because oftentimes our past is a catalyst, can be a catalyst for our choosing whatever symptom it is to hide pain from the past or shame from the past, abuse, trauma. What was your life like growing up?
My life growing up was about as boring as any origin story of any addict I've ever met.
Really?
And that's the piece of my story that is maybe most unique, is that it was incredibly safe and loving and ideal. It wasn't perfect, right? There's no perfect family, but I mean, I've responded to that question. I've thought about that. I've shared my testimony. Is like, I don't know if this is the case, but I almost wonder if like that's just one more thing that like God did to teach me, like there was no crutch to point to. I didn't need anything to push me to find sin. I went and found it.
Well, yeah.
So I'm the baby of 5, and still really close with my siblings to this day. 4 out of 5 of us still live in Alaska. I actually work with 2 of my siblings, which is really cool. And I don't say this lightly. I don't take this for granted. There was never a day in my life where I didn't feel loved.
Really?
There was never a time that I felt that I was in danger in my house. And I took that for granted all the time as a kid. I don't take that for granted now. And, I mean, I don't know what the stats would say, but just anecdotally from, years of recovery and talking to folks with other addiction recovery, I mean, it's got to be probably 95% of someone that's in recovery has a very acute abuse, trauma story, some real tragedy. And I did not have any of that.
Wow. That's amazing, because over the last 28 years of being involved in faith-based recovery, you're correct in that statistic. Maybe not always abuse, not always trauma, but dysfunction.
Right.
Not feeling loved, abandoned, no nurturing,
Right.
Father and mother dealing with their own struggles and demons and other things. And so the influences were there.
Yeah.
But I rarely, Logan, hear from anybody like yourself that had that, loving, nurturing family upbringing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. That's a blessing.
It is. I mean, because there's so much infrastructure that I took for granted, but that now I'm able to just have it as a complete blessing of, having, again, not that we're perfect by a long shot,
No.
right? But having siblings that I love, that we can talk with about deep things and also just fun things or whatever, and just be buddies. And now there are, a couple pieces that definitely didn't recognize as a kid, and to some extent didn't recognize until fairly recently, that, still not tragedy, not trauma, that would totally be an exaggeration, but just, factors that were there. There was one thing that I've identified that really wasn't there with my family. And again, compared to most things that an addict is going to say, this pales in comparison, but it is a real factor. So my parents, they did a really good job equipping us. They did a really good job teaching us the right things. We did not just go to church because that was the thing to do. And no, we went to church to learn about God. We were taught the right things. We had Bible studies and discussions and all this stuff. My parents, while not being perfect, they did a really good job of, practicing what they preached. But there was one thing that they didn't really ever do, and that was be vulnerable. They weren't really ever vulnerable about, they would teach us biblical principles, and they lived out those biblical principles, but they didn't really ever share personal stories of, what their struggles had looked like, or, how they had learned these lessons and that kind of thing. So there was definitely an element of, okay, do these things because the Bible says to do these things. God says to do these things, and we do these things. So you should do them. And again, like compared to most parents, like they did a fabulous job in most things, but I do look back and I go, yeah, they weren't really ever vulnerable about their weaknesses and that kind of thing. And this is something I've talked to both my parents about since then. The other thing, there's a lot going on here, but so my dad, 2016 was a big year for us. Got into serious recovery. I had attended some meetings and stuff before. I can get into that, but got into serious recovery, started my mentorship program, got sober. That was all in spring, and May 19th was the last day I acted out. Our youngest son was born March 31st, 2016. And in between those two events, my dad left my mom after 35 years of marriage. And not to make this about him and his stuff, but there was definitely a lot of, him following a path of selfishness, him not working on tough things, that kind of thing. So I'm not pointing to that, not blaming that at all.
Yeah.
But just, I look at that and I go, that's like, I don't know necessarily how that played in, but that's a thing. That's a factor. Right?
Well, you and your siblings, I mean, what did you observe between mom and dad and their relationship growing up? I mean, there was commitment, I guess, and
that's part of it.
Were there anything blind spots that you all missed?
So that was one thing that I did realize.
Vulnerability was one, but anything else that you may have overlooked or just?
Yeah, I don't even know that I recognized the lack of vulnerability as a kid. I started to recognize that as I got older, kind of older teen. But I mean, something that I noticed, I mean, even as a 10-year-old would have been, mom and dad were awesome parents.
Yeah.
They were never really great spouses.
Yeah.
And again, I didn't come on here to have a conversation about like, I'm not trying to bash them, right? It's just, they were really, really good at raising kids together and doing life together in a practical sense.
Yeah.
But there was not that connection between them.
Interesting.
And so, it's kind of that, I mean, their story is unique to them. And yet it's also something that I think we see a lot of where, two people, when they're done raising those kids, it's like, wait, what do we do? What are we doing together?
It happens a lot. Especially with the empty nesters and things like that. And all of a sudden, when your whole life is, supporting your kids and hauling your kids and sporting events and, musicals and school and this and all of a sudden they look at each other across the table and like, oh, you're who now? Yeah.
Right.
That's why it's so vital in marriage. Debbie and I have been together, married 31 years. I know a ton of couples. No one's got it right, man. Nobody's got it right. But, when there's commitment, vulnerability, transparency, trust, honesty, and forgiveness, those are good. That's a good formula for, a secure marriage. But I mean, sounds like mom and dad were hiding instead of healing.
Yeah.
Truly.
Yeah.
But it's good to understand that though, So you're living in Alaska. Amazing. So what did you do? I think you said it was rather boring, but what was
boring in the sense of like, so as part of living in a very safe, very loving, very structured house, it was also fairly sheltered, and we lived
Is it
Um,
rural? You live in a
but
very rural area?
yes and no. So we lived in Anchorage,
Yeah,
which
okay.
is, it's smaller than pretty much any other state's big city, but it's still it's a
Okay.
legitimate city. It's about a
Yeah.
quarter million people,
Right, right.
but we lived about 12 minutes outside, so we were surrounded by miles of forest.
That's cool.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, we had neighbors and stuff, but it was, there was nothing other than other houses for miles.
Okay.
So, growing up as a kid, like, we had one other house that had kids within a mile. And so thankfully they had a couple boys and those were my buddies. I mean, those are really my only friends, like growing up other than my
Wow,
siblings. And then, I'd go to
okay.
church on Sundays.
Yeah.
But whether for better or for worse, like, there was no sneaking out as a teenager to go to somebody's house, because I ain't walking 10 miles. There's there were not a lot of hanging out and sleepovers and that kind of thing, other than maybe like for my birthday.
Yeah.
I always played sports.
Yeah.
That was baseball up until middle school, basketball in high school, going to the YMCA and playing basketball in high school and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It was a lot of sports and a lot of time with family and a lot of church.
That's cool. That's so over the last 8 years, May 19th, coming up on anniversary,
Yeah.
4 days from now, but over the last 8 years, so you've immersed yourself in healing and getting well, transforming your life, changing the way you think, healing that soul of yours, and being set free from sexual addiction. Now, over the course of your recovery, one of the most, did you go through the 12 steps? Were those incorporated in your recovery? So you obviously, did you do an inventory?
Yeah.
The 4
Yeah.
step. So in that
Yep.
4th step, you're looking back at, you're really doing taking account of people, situations, experiences, and things like that. So when you're describing the life that you're living, and you're not really looking back in trauma or abuse or just absolute despair, but not only the vulnerability that came from mom and dad, but what other places or situations or emotions, or did you uncover?
There wasn't much uncovering, to be
Really?
honest.
Okay.
My inventory, I mean, obviously there was a lot. So I'm not deeply familiar with different types of inventory that other programs do.
Yeah.
I know that there can be some differences for sure.
Sure.
And obviously a lot of differences in terms of how we actually process the inventory.
Sure.
For me and for Prodigals, the group that I'm a part of.
Okay.
So it is my fears,
Okay.
my resentments,
Okay.
my harms to other people, and then there's a whole category for my sexual harms. So those
Okay.
4 categories.
Okay. Yeah.
Um,
I'm familiar with those. Yeah.
and so like my resentments was, I mean, we did a lot of digging, but it was a lot of fairly, like, it was a lot of stuff within the last few years. It was, some, I mean, I can definitely struggle with resentment. There was resentments to coworkers and bosses and things like that.
Sure.
And some friends, some, certain like groups of people, that kind of thing. But it was a lot of harms, a lot of sexual harms.
Yeah.
It was a lot of, like, my goodness, I've been a selfish, just sociopathic monster for years.
So you've had 8 years of self-awareness, major in-depth self-awareness. Emotion.
I mean, every day is another exercise in that, but yes.
Well, for all of us. But emotionally, I mean, think about it. The soul is the catalyst for us emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually. And essentially, you've been on this soul healing restoration. Well, David prayed that, and he wrote the Psalm 23. He restores my soul, and then he leads me on a path of righteousness. I drilled down on that a lot. The soul is often overlooked when it comes to healing. So you've done this 8 years worth of self-awareness. So my question is, okay, when were you first exposed to pornography? What age were you?
I have picked the age of 9 because I don't remember exactly. Maybe I was 8, maybe I was 10. I know it was pre-puberty. It was before I knew what masturbation was, sex, anything like that.
Yeah.
So what I say is 9, at 9 years old. And it was not what the average person would consider pornography, but it was training myself to view pornography. So it was lingerie and swimwear ads in the JCPenney catalog, the annual giant catalog that you'd get at Christmas time. And I remember, I don't remember if I was searching for it, but I remember coming across, okay, there's women in bikini and I like how I felt, when I saw that.
Yeah.
So that was literally my introduction to it.
Mm-hmm.
Then within a fairly short time frame, I wanted to see more of that. So then you talked about, how things used to be with pornography. Yeah, I didn't grow up in the 60s or 70s. But I felt like it. I grew up in a sheltered home.
True.
With, and still we're talking late 90s. There's no iPads, there's no smartphones,
Yeah.
Dial up internet and it again, conservative home. So it was, sneaking upstairs to get on the computer on a rare occasion where I could do that.
Wow.
And it was, I'd look at still photos of what I had seen in the JCPenney catalogs essentially. And to give an idea of the progression of this, because that's a huge part of, sexual addiction and I would any addiction is that progression, right?
Oh, well, there's a trigger. So there was a trigger, temptation, and then it creates desire for more, and that's what started to happen. That's what happens in these brains of ours.
Yep.
These synapses, these pathways begin to form, and we want to satisfy those pathways on a regular basis. And so trigger, temptation, desire at 9 years old.
Yep.
And you're off.
And I remember the first time, this is a lot of my past is not necessarily vivid memories for multiple reasons, but there, especially as I got deeper and deeper, I did so much compartmentalization, so much like gaslighting myself, and just blocking things out so I could live any sort of life of like relative sanity. So in a lot of ways, my memory got more and more jacked up the longer I went. But there are certain things that are very vivid that I don't think I'll ever forget. I will always remember the first naked photo that I ever saw.
Yeah.
And I'll always remember my response. And it's not what some people might imagine. My response was I was repulsed.
Really?
It was gross to me.
Really?
So again, I'm like 9 years old and I'm specifically looking for, bikini and lingerie photos. And a naked woman showed up on the computer screen. These are still photos.
Yeah.
And I had never seen that. So I had not yet associated that with something that I wanted to look at. So at first that was gross to me.
Really?
And I remember skipping past it like, I don't want to see that.
Huh.
Because I hadn't yet trained myself to objectify that.
Okay.
Relatively speaking, I quickly moved past that and then started to seek that.
Yeah.
Although I do think even outside of addiction, I do think there's something there that is there's always something enticing about what's hidden.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I think even just from a very natural standpoint, because at that point I wasn't an addict. At that point, I hadn't become fully trained to this stuff. At that point, there was still some innocence in terms of a biological sense, right?
Sure.
And so, that sense of like, I want the tease. I wasn't ready for the full thing in a way.
Yeah.
But then it was probably, I think a couple years later, I started looking at hardcore pornographic videos. I learned how to masturbate as a maybe 13 years old, 14 years old. And then it was, this whole other level, because now I can do something with these feelings and,
Gotcha.
and, that then there's a whole other, of course, physical high that I'm getting from this.
So you were essentially you were laying the ground, and that's what happens with with all of us that struggle, whatever substance, whatever issue it's going to be. You're kind of laying the groundwork, and so
Yeah.
from 9 to 13, and 13, you took it to another level, and it does. That's where the progression comes in, and that's what I've heard from so many men over the years. It started very innocently, like yourself, and then next thing you know, it's prostitutes and clubs, and yeah. So
Yep.
so from 13 until your young adult life, that was your pattern then from then on?
Yeah, and it still was a very sporadic pattern because of opportunity. I mean, I can't emphasize enough. Like it was not common that I could get an opportunity to get on the computer.
So you're not talking an everyday, but the fantasy.
No, I would have if I could have.
What about the fantasy part?
The fantasy was still, it was still very like kind of rudimentary. I mean, I was still to what I'm about to say is this is an analogy. I'm not trying to make this stuff less or more than it is. What I became when I was 19, 20, up until early recovery, I became an absolute predator. I became an absolute monster.
Wow.
So to use that lens, when I'm 13, 14, 15, I was basically, if I became this full-grown tiger just trying to kill whatever I could kill and hunt whatever I could hunt, at this time I'm like a little tiger cub. So I'm still kind of learning. I'm learning how to fantasize. I'm learning how to groom myself. Like, forget about grooming other people. That did become a part of my addiction. I had to learn how to groom myself, groom my own situation. If anyone's familiar with the relapse cycle, that planning and grooming.
Absolutely.
I had to groom my own mind to get myself ready to accept what was previously unacceptable. Well, now let's figure out how to work that in.
Yeah. So we're all right. Let's talk about the conflict. So you enter into this lifestyle. Your mind, your desires are all being changed. To satisfy, the addiction. But you grew up in church. You certainly knew God's word. You definitely were instructed about sin. And when sin enters in and living a life apart from God. And it's interesting you mentioned that we want what is uncovered. Well, that's exactly what happened in Genesis chapter 3. It wasn't uncovered. They were told not to take that one thing.
The forbidden.
Yeah, exactly. And so Genesis 3 is the origin of addiction. It just is. That's the origin of addiction. Because it was pleasing. They desired it. When you read, Genesis chapter 3, and then shame and pain and everything else.
Satan doesn't say, hey, do you want to go get hurt?
No.
He says, do you want something fun?
No, you want something really good, really pleasing, and it's going to make you think like God. And, So anyway, all that to say, where was your spirit? How was your spiritual battle being a man of God, child of God, man of God? But I'm hiding this. Talk about that.
I don't think there's a day in my life that I have not believed that God is real. I don't think there's been a day in my life that I didn't believe that Jesus was God who became man, who died on the cross for our sins and all of that. Like I always have believed those things to be true. Of course, I know my Bible. Like I also knew as a, 12, 13-year-old kid, like so does Satan, right? The demons know that stuff too.
Yeah.
But I mean, I would have called myself a Christian this whole time.
Okay.
I got baptized. I actually got baptized a couple times because, when I was a little bit older, I'm like, oh, I need to get baptized again because now I'm really a Christian. I wasn't a Christian back then. But yeah, I doubted my salvation consistently, on an almost nightly basis.
Where was your shame level?
It was very high. It wasn't to self-hatred yet. That came later. That came in my 20s when I was married.
When did you get married? How old were you?
I was 20.
And Carrie, how
I
old
was
was Carrie?
almost 21, and she was 21.
Okay.
So we got married young, started having kids young,
And
and that's when, I mean, everything just absolutely exploded.
was she,
And
how long did you date before you got married?
not very long. We started dating at the end, or like the start of 2010.
And like most guys, well, if I get married, this issue that I'm struggling with since 9 years old will go away. Did you feel that?
Absolutely. And I'd never heard that before. Now I hear that. I've heard that hundreds of times, right? I had never heard that before. And yet
Yeah.
I absolutely believe
Yeah,
that.
if I get married, absolutely. Oh yeah. No, this will just go away.
Right.
Nah.
Well, and when we were dating, to that point, I had some encounters with girls, but never had a stable enough relationship to cheat on someone.
Right.
And I absolutely had laid the groundwork. Looking back on it, I had laid the groundwork of being a predator. I had laid the groundwork of chasing after new and different. I had laid the groundwork of seeking attention and getting a hit just from the attention, let alone any actual physical contact.
Right.
I had absolutely started all that muscle memory,
Right.
but I didn't realize it. So when we were dating, like I told her that I struggle with pornography and I don't like that I look at it, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to stop,
Yeah.
So she knew that, but there was no, I've, been unfaithful, because I hadn't done that yet.
But what was Carrie's attitude towards or response to your admission?
She took it at face value of, okay, she didn't like it either, but she's like, okay, well, you're working on it. You're trying to stop. Okay. That's good. Like we all are not perfect.
And you
so that's
promised
just a
you'd never
struggle you
do
have.
it again.
I don't remember. I don't think I ever said that, but
Yeah.
but of course, how many times did I do it and then say, oh, God, forgive me, and I'll never do it again? Prayed that prayer many times. I hesitate to even call it a prayer, because that's not real prayer, but it was me being, selfishly asking God the vending machine. Right.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But it was, and for context sake, so Carrie and I mean, we spent a good deal of time talking about my upbringing, right? Carrie grew up the opposite.
Oh,
She grew up broken home, abuse,
wow. Okay.
A lot of dysfunction. It wasn't the darkest upbringing of, I've heard darker upbringings, but it was very different from mine. And, did not go to church, did not hear about God, all this stuff. And, of course, if somebody's listening audio only, they won't be able to capture this. But if you picture a line, going up and a line, coming down, I mean, I'm the line that started with this great infrastructure, and I'm just seeking a way to go down. And she had this really rough infrastructure, and she's trying to learn about God. And so we kind of met at the same point, where we basically had about an equal amount of healthy decision-making process.
Yeah.
And about an equal amount of kind of, healthy infrastructure. And yet we were on literally opposite trajectories.
Wow.
But again, didn't realize that at that time.
So, all right. So you get married. You're immersed in your addiction, acting out, and how it progressed. When did you get married? What year?
So I got married June 4th, 2011.
2011. Okay. So over the next 5 years, what went down? I mean, you took it to a whole new level after you got married.
Well, it actually started before that. Well, it started before we got married. When we said our vows, June 4th, 2011,
yeah,
I had already cheated on her multiple times.
You had?
Yeah, it was several months before we got married.
Okay.
So I was a car salesman. I started selling cars August of 2010. And so 6.5 years I sold cars, or excuse me, 6 years I sold cars. And I was a good salesman, not because I was the best with sales tactics or I was the smartest guy when it came to trucks,
right?
But I was good at connecting with people. I was good at building trust and building rapport.
Well,
and
that
those
works
are fine.
That works extremely well.
If my drug is seeking attention from women and getting women to Absolutely. And so these traits are fine. They're not bad or good. They're just traits.
Right.
And yet I abused them so much.
Wow.
And so I cheated on Carrie for the first time. And so that would have been the winter, like the end of 2010 or the start of 2011.
Yeah.
And then I cheated on her a couple more times.
Okay.
Didn't tell her about any of this stuff. So we were living separately. So, she didn't know where I was coming and going, that kind of thing. So it was relatively easy to hide in that way.
Right.
But the shame went to a whole nother level. The depravity went to a whole nother level.
That was my next question. What was your, where was your shame level at that point? And it was pretty.
And the only reason it wasn't, it definitely wasn't at an all-time high, because I remember what all-time highs felt like. All-time high, it was all-time low.
Right.
Because of, for one, because my sin itself started to get even deeper and even thicker.
Yeah.
But also the tangible reminders of what I was doing became so much more prevalent.
Okay.
Those little faces of my kids,
yeah.
those started appearing, right?
Yeah.
When I was married and I'm going, I'm in bed with my wife, and I'm waking up next to my wife, those things hadn't started yet. I remember, talk about vivid memories. One of the times I cheated on my wife, I stayed the night with a girl that I'd sold a car to. And my wife, again, you talk about different trajectories. Carrie and I were engaged, and she had been attending our church that I grew up in for a little while now. And she's like full on, like, so thankful to be a part of the Christian community, so thankful to be a part of this new family, so thankful to have friends that are healthy and all this. And she was part of what she did when she first started joining the church is she helped with the ladies ministry, and she was helping set up a ladies' tea. And I remember her texting me, and I'm in this bed, and Carrie's texting me, and she's like, I don't remember the exact verbiage, but basically like, hey, I got to go help set up tables, for the tea. And I'm in that bed. I'm in that house, and I remember standing in church with her. That was a Saturday. I remember standing in church with her the next day, knowing what I did the day before, knowing what I did, the 2 nights prior. So self-hatred was starting. It hadn't gotten as bad as it got, but it was very much starting.
I bet it was,
because it just continued over the next several years.
So let's talk about that that defining moment, or that desperation moment, when you arrived in 2016, May 19th, I think it was. What led up to that? My question is also, oftentimes God's hand is always on us. You made decisions, poor decisions. I've made my own, but many have. But, his hand is always on us. And there are situations that happen up until the point where the pain is greater than our fear, and we're done. We're absolutely finished. I'm done. And it's authentic and it's real. So May 19th, what led up to that? And then share about May 19th, 2016.
So the desperation started in July of 2015.
Okay.
There's this whole almost year journey of desperation, the pain reaching such a point.
Yeah.
And there's a key person that pain reached, and it wasn't me. It was Carrie.
Yeah.
So the entire month of July, I had an affair with yet another person that I had sold a car to. Most of my encounters to that point, and I use the word encounter just, not to be vague, to hide anything, but to not be graphic, right?
Right.
So most of my encounters had been one-time encounters. Okay. And this was not. This was a full-on, month-long, very enmeshed, emotional plus physical thing.
Okay.
And it was somebody that, it wasn't somebody that Carrie knew personally, but she knew of this person. And Carrie wondered if there was something. So it was very different than most of the other times.
Okay.
It was something where, Carrie had asked questions, is there anything going on? What's going on here? And I had, so I'd lied to her face in a way that I had not done in previous
Really?
To back up just really quickly, because this might sound kind of confusing. So I started confessing within the first year of our marriage. I confessed about 6 or 7 months after we got married. I confessed, hey, I've been unfaithful. And I wrote a letter and I shared this with her because I thought I was done. I thought I was just going to toggle switch off and not do it anymore. I felt so bad. I'm never going to do this again.
Right.
And so then I did it again, maybe a year later, confessed again. So I'd given her these.
So you're continuing to be triggered over and over and over again because your brain was completely rewired. Your soul is wrecked. And this, like you said, the self-hatred entered in finally.
Yeah.
And the
I
shame
created a
level was
complete double life.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Complete double life where my entire way of interacting with the world around me was just completely depraved. It was
Totally. Yeah.
Any woman that I interact with. I mean almost any woman. It didn't have to be somebody that looked like a model. Almost any woman, I would almost subconsciously, not literally subconsciously, I was in control of it, but almost subconsciously, I would like verbally or psychologically kind of probe a little bit. Like, is there something here? Is there something? Is there some sort of hit that I could get?
Every woman.
Maybe a physical interaction, maybe not. Maybe a text, maybe a little bit of a flirting joke. Whatever I could take, I would get. And if that woman wouldn't give me anything, I'll move on to the next woman. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say like I became this sociopathic predator. I mean, that's what I was.
Yeah.
So all this time, I'm just going through, just wrecking everything around me. My wife, of course, so we've got 4 kids. We started having kids young. So during most of this time, she's got babies. She's got, kids in diapers. She would tell you, she shares this in her testimony. She's trying to focus on survival. She's trying to focus on keeping the kids fed and the kids safe and put the kids down for naps.
Right.
So, then, here comes Logan coming home and vomiting on her basically. Hey, here's all this crap I did. Blech. Well, now I feel better because I got it off my chest.
Yeah.
She feels, of course, so much worse because it's like I just came home and stabbed her.
Right.
So that had been happening for years, for several years.
Right.
And in 2015, I had this month-long affair that, as in Carrie's own words, was the most painful time that I've ever cheated on her was that affair. And I confessed that to her. And she did something she'd never done before. And she gave me an ultimatum. And she said, Logan, if there's not serious change, if you don't get help, then me and the boys are gone. And she was pregnant with our 4th, and we had the 3 kids, 3 boys.
Wow.
And I believed her. I knew that she meant that because Carrie doesn't just speak from a place of like rash emotion. She means what she says.
Yeah.
So I took a test, an online test. Are you a sex addict? Passed that thing with flying colors. And again, like almost a year between that and sobriety. So it was not a toggle switch off. It was not instant healing. And I acted out to pornography many times over the next 10 months.
Okay.
Never had sex with another woman. But even that was largely opportunity. I still put myself in terrible situations.
Yeah.
But like but Carrie, she was like, you need to try something. You need to try to do something. And so I started going to some meetings. I started to put myself out there a bit, to help. But it was so much of me like, okay, God, I'll try to heal, but let me kind of run this thing. And just, falling on my face over and over. At one point I had 4 months of sobriety, from the end of July to the end of November. And I'd been going to Sex Addicts Anonymous groups. It's basically AA, right, for sex addicts. And I'm not here to bash any group. I think every group is as strong as the people leading it.
God works in everything.
Yep.
He works better, but he works better where he is Lord over the addiction.
Exactly. And so, classic, some people would talk about God, and I was free to talk about God, but obviously, it wasn't Christ-based.
Yeah.
And just as a point of practicality, the group was just, it was a few guys. It was usually me and 3 other guys, and the guy leading it had about a year and a half of sobriety.
Yeah.
But like but had not experienced any healing. His wife still had no trust in him. He wasn't allowed to give his phone number out to guys. It was just, and again, like none of that is to, I'm thankful that man was doing what he could to give back. I'm thankful for that.
Yeah.
But it was just a really hard environment to heal because there wasn't really a lot of, there wasn't hope in that group.
So when did you enter into, was it the prodigals? Is that right?
Yeah. So I went to a few of the various groups, right? And at one point I met a guy named Rick, and he's like, hey, so not prodigals yet, but he was my conduit to that. So he was like, hey, we're at a Celebrate Recovery group. And so, it's
Celebrate
grace-based,
Recovery. Yep.
12-step.
Yeah.
But like other groups I'd been to, still they weren't allowed to give feedback. They weren't allowed to ask clarifying questions. So I could still do what I'd been doing for years, which was show up and share what made me feel better, not necessarily be rigorously honest.
Oh, really?
And Rick goes, right. Again, that's how this group was.
Was it not a trusted place or a safe place for you, or it just wasn't the protocol?
Well, no, it was the protocol because they wanted it to be a safe place.
Yeah.
So every person would share, how their week had been or how their day had been, but people weren't allowed to ask them questions or give them feedback or advice.
Right. Exactly.
And so for me as a guy sharing, it's like, I get where they're coming from.
Yeah.
The last thing I needed was a safe place. I needed guys to get in my face and call me out on my garbage.
Well, after group, didn't you develop a support network with anybody from either of those, from the group of three or Celebrate Recovery?
So not at that time. Now, and again, I mean, owning my part, like I was still doing the bare minimum to, show up to meetings and kind of make my wife satisfied. Right.
Okay.
And so Rick pulls me aside and he goes, yeah, I'm glad you're here. I'm happy you're here. Thankful for that. Given your story, I think you need something more. I think you need something more intense.
Yeah. Good.
He goes,
Smart.
I needed something more intense.
Good.
And kind of kept him at arm's length. And at one point I told him, I said, Rick, so he and I, out of a group of like 20 guys, probably 18 of those were substance in recovery for some various substance. Rick and I were the only two that said, I'm here for sexual addiction.
Yeah.
And so Rick, I told him, I go, Rick, you think we could get together for coffee sometime and maybe like we could meet every couple weeks for coffee and talk about sexual addiction? And in my mind, like I'm really trying something. I'm really putting myself out there. So I told you earlier that my dad left in March of 16, right?
Right.
I still talk to him, but it's not the same.
Right.
So Rick has become a father to me. He's become a grandpa to my kids, and he's literally become my best friend outside of Carrie.
Really?
He's one of the most loving men that I know, one of the most generous men I know. Well, when I said that, Rick looked at me. He goes, Logan, if you want to get together for coffee every now and again, I don't have time for you.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that hurt me. That was offensive to me. Nobody had ever talked to me like that.
That's great.
He quickly followed up and he said, if you want to work on things, I will walk with you, but it's not going to be getting together for coffee twice a month. It's going to be hard work. You're going to hate it. You're probably going to hate me. And I had never faced that. I had gotten my way. I'd always been able to work the room and get my way.
Rick, well, of course, because you were good at manipulating whatever the relationship or the situation. That was a gift of yours, if you want to call,
And he could see that. He's like, could see exactly what I was trying to do. Right?
No, Ricks are all over the place, and it's great. That was a godsend for you.
Yep.
Totally.
Yep.
Yeah. God definitely, he orchestrated that relationship.
100%.
Yeah.
I'm so thankful for that.
So what happened next?
So he's like, hey, there's this group prodigals. At this point, there was the only group in Alaska was the group in Anchorage that was prodigals.
Yeah.
And he had graduated from their program several years prior, maybe a decade prior. And he's like, why don't you come with me to Anchorage and we can carpool? And I still kept him at arm's length for several months. I'm like, I'm acting out less. I'm doing better. In my mind, I thought I was doing better.
Yeah.
So I kept him at arm's length. And then finally in March, I went with him.
Okay.
So if people are doing the math at home, still not sober for a couple more months, right? But in March, I went to a meeting, and that was the first moment. I didn't get sober, but that was the first moment where I had hope, because I had met Rick, but I'm like, man, maybe Rick hadn't done the kind of things I did, right? Maybe Rick doesn't really understand me. I don't know if there's actual hope for me. Well, then I met other guys that had just as much, if not more, sobriety than Rick, that had transformed lives, that had in most, not every, but most cases, transformed marriages, restored marriages. And these were guys who had dozens of affairs, who had hired prostitutes, who had, been abusive men, who had done everything that I had done.
Mm.
And so I'm like, in that moment, I remember thinking, okay, I don't know what they had to do, but there's something here. There's something different.
So-
and this was a Christ-based recovery program, but it was very intense.
But let me ask you, did you sit there and say, I want what they have?
Yes. And that was the first time that I had that.
That's a wonderful, that says a lot about the organization, the group, the transparency, because I'm convinced that healing happens in circles in those chairs. And you got to listen to other guys, and you realized I'm not the only one out here on this island of isolation. These guys, man, I want what they got. I want what they have.
Given where I had taken things, given what I had done, it's not an exaggeration. I mean, Craig, I literally thought I've done too much. There can be no healing from this.
Oh, wow.
I remember having the thought, maybe, possibly, I had such vivid thoughts of this. Maybe I can be the thief on the cross. Maybe on my deathbed, I can say, God, please forgive me and please take me. So there's no life that will ever be restored.
So
because I've done too much.
When did you stop feeling that? When did you?
Probably about a year of sobriety, honestly.
Okay. So from May 2016, May 2017.
Yeah. And I mean, when I say a year of sobriety, I'm kind of being arbitrary with saying 1 year, but it was probably about halfway through my program, which was a 2-year program. So where I had actually developed enough traction with dealing with triggers, not perfectly. I still made dumb decisions, but I wasn't doing the same stuff. I wasn't acting out.
Right.
And so it was about a year through where I'm like, wait, maybe I can actually not have affairs. Maybe I can actually not masturbate. Maybe I actually don't need to keep looking at porn.
Wow.
And like, this was, none of that had ever occurred to me. I never thought that was possible.
Was that like an epiphany for you?
It wasn't like a singular moment. It was honestly very gradual.
Yeah.
But because there was always something in the back of my head.
But that's the healing of your brain, your soul being restored, transformed, your everything.
Yeah.
Mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually.
Yep.
I mean,
and the spiritual part really took hold about 2 years in.
Yeah.
It was about the end of my program.
Yeah.
Where for the first time in my life.
Yeah.
And again, there wasn't a singular moment. There wasn't like a day where I woke up and I just felt, totally different. But I remember about the time almost that I was graduating from the program, close to that time, where I remember going, like, I can pray. I can talk to God. Because to that point, here's what prayer was. Prayer was me confessing like the worst things a man can do. That was the only prayer I was doing.
Yeah.
And so realizing like I can just talk to God and I'm 8 years into sobriety. I'm still figuring out, how to hear God and how to learn. And I'm still on that journey. But I have a relationship with Christ. I never thought I could have that.
Right.
For so long.
1 John chapter 1, verses 8 through 10, where, when you, it talks about, God is just to forgive us of our sins, and that's where we usually end. But then he also says he also cleanses us of all unrighteousness, and that's the part that all of us go through in faith-based recovery, and is that second part. Yeah, we want our sins forgiven. Oh, Lord, forgive me for doing this, and forgive, confession, repentance and confession are absolutely essential in our transformation. Right. Essential. But it's over and over. It can come, it can be repetitive, but then we overlook at the same time, if we're not being cleansed of all unrighteousness, and that's where our soul is being cleansed of all unrighteousness, which in turn leads you to develop, and myself and others, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. It took you 2 years, but that's okay. I mean, these things, it took you years to get in it. It's not going to take, a week or 30-day rehab to get out of it.
Yeah. Because there's different stats, and the stats are a little bit different, and what they're tracking is a little bit different. Maybe,
right.
But you can find different stats with sexual addiction specifically.
Yeah.
And it's usually it's between like 4 to 8 years before there's like some real true healing that takes place. And there's different ways to quantify that. Right. But I would totally agree with that. I would absolutely agree that because there was part of me in the back of my head for, the entire time of my up through my mid 20s. And even until like maybe a year of recovery where, okay, like I'm doing better, but I'm still doing a lot of white knuckling.
Yeah.
And if there was a strong enough temptation, I think I would probably go back. I remember thinking that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And whereas now, and I don't say this from a place of hubris, I say this from gratitude. Like, no, I don't need to. Yeah. I don't need to go back. And there's tools I have, and there's healing that's taken place, but like, no, I don't need that. Temptation can and will come, but no. And plus temptation before was so strong. 90% of the temptation that I was getting faced with before I would act out, it wasn't just temptation that was coming randomly. It was like, well, I've crossed over like 10 appropriate levels of behavior. Yeah. So now this 11th behavior or this 11th level, it was like, well, yeah, because I'm in the car with somebody. Like I should never even be in this situation.
Right. Exactly.
This didn't hit me. I put myself here.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have to have boundaries are so important.
Yep.
For us guys, especially, and women as well that struggle. Well, Logan, we got a few minutes left. Talk to that person that is really, really struggling, and how can they, if you want to share your website, but also any information on the prodigals or any of those resources, if you would share those for the viewers and listeners and who they could reach out to find help. Yeah.
So I'll share a couple resources. And then I'm not going to get preachy, but I'll just share a little message, I guess, to maybe what I would have needed to hear at that moment. So the first couple things are just resources that thankfully I've become acquainted with that are incredible resources. So if somebody really wants to learn about sexual addiction and how it affects me spiritually as well as scientifically, which like those are not different things. God created the universe. God's in charge of how science works, at contrary sometimes to what Christians and others would have an addict believe or somebody in recovery believe. So it dives really, really deeply into how the brain works and how my body and my brain are responding to all these things. The Conquer series is an incredible resource. You can, I have the DVD set. That's how I've always watched it. It's several hours. You can also watch it digitally. And that's by Ted Roberts, who does Pure Desire Ministry. The other resource is an author, Doug Weiss, fantastic sexual addiction expert and author. He's written books for couples, books for women that have been hurt in this way, like the groups that my wife is involved in and leads is for a woman that's been healed or that needs healing from the sexual betrayal trauma. Excellent. So Doug Weiss is an author that has fantastic resources. Website, if folks want to contact me or get some tools and some of these resources are on the website as well, right, is prodigalsofalaska.com. And I can make sure you have those to put them in the show notes.
Sure. Yeah, I will.
And then, so I'll end with this. I mean, like those are all tools and those are resources and those are awesome. If I'm super out of shape and I've never worked out in a day in my life, you can tell me about the best gym and the best workout equipment in the world. That doesn't matter if I don't use it. Right.
Right.
So tools don't get me sober. Tools Absolutely. Don't heal me. We both know that. So my whole purpose in coming on this show and like it in shows like this is just to shout from the rooftops. Yeah. I didn't think that there was a way out. I didn't think that there was healing because I had done too much. I was too unique in my struggle. There was no healing or hope for Logan. So, if you're hearing this, that there is hope, there is healing.
Absolutely.
And I take this very seriously that, one of the things I've learned in recovery and I don't ever want to stop thinking this way is when God puts a potential resource in front of me, if he opens a door with a person that I meet or a book that somebody recommends, I'm not necessarily going to dive deeply into every single resource that God puts in front of me.
Right.
But I'm not going to lightly ignore it. I'm not going to
Right.
just brush it aside. And so if you're struggling, if you feel like, you're so unique, there's no healing, let this be a door that God is opening.
Amen.
There is hope and healing. And yeah, if somebody has a question, I don't do sexual addiction coaching for like a living. I mean, this is not my day job.
Right.
But I'm more than happy to answer a question, to hop on a phone call, to respond to an email.
Yeah.
If folks want to reach out, I can at least be one of the hands that reaches down into the pit, to help. So I'm more than happy to do that.
Man, I'm so happy for you and Carrie in the ministry that you're now doing and helping others. I mean, that's exactly what we're called to do, to take our brokenness and have God use it to help another brother, help another sister, and help another married couple. I pray an abundance of blessings over you and Carrie and you, Logan, and your testimony and your healing and restoration. I so appreciate you being open, vulnerable, and transparent during our time together, and I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Craig. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you to all of you who joined us today for Stop Hiding, Start Healing. If you would like us, Stop Hiding, Start Healing, to come to your church for a seminar or any other event, conference, be sure to reach out to us at stophidingstarthealing.org, stophidingstarthealing.org. And I'll be sure to list all of the websites and resources that Logan mentioned. Those will be in the show notes for you to reference. If anything was shared today, we pray that in some way, shape, or form, that you heard something, that the Lord used something that was said today to get you to that place where you stop hiding and start healing and get on that road to transformation. So thank you again. See you next time on Stop Hiding, Start Healing.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Stop Hiding, Start Healing. We hope our time together has ignited a spark of self-discovery and inspired you to take bold steps towards healing and growth through Christ-centered recovery. Remember, the journey is ongoing, and every choice you make to confront your challenges and embrace your true self brings you closer to a life of meaning and purpose. If you enjoyed this episode, don't hesitate to share it with others who might find encouragement and strength in our discussions. Be sure to get a copy of Craig's book, Stop Hiding, Start Healing, available on Amazon and where books are sold. And visit our website, stophidingstarthealing.org, for more information and to invite Craig to speak at your next event, seminar, retreat, or conference. Be sure to join us next time. And remember, it's time for you to stop hiding and start healing.